My son didn't invite me on his wedding because of her father demands. I'm not enough wealthy. I was sanding the edge of a maple table when the phone buzzed across the workbench. And because I was working against a deadline for a customer who liked to photograph every joint like it was going in a museum catalog, I let it buzz once, then twice, then a third time. And by the fourth, I wiped my hands on a towel that always smelled faintly like mineral oil and old coffee, and I answered, thinking it was a client, or the guy from the lumberyard telling me the kiln-dried batch had come in, or maybe my sister calling to remind me to pick up my niece from soccer practice like I promised. But it was my son, and before I could say his name the way only a father says it, soft but steady, with a small private pride tucked inside the vowels, he spoke in that careful, rehearsed tone that adults use when they are about to do something that feels wrong and want you to believe it's inevitable. Dad, I need you to hear me without interrupting, because if I say it fast it will be easier, he said, and the words dropped like screws off a countertop, each one louder, because I knew from the start there would be a last one, and I wasn't sure I wanted to live in the silence that came after. I told him to go ahead, and he did, and I listened, and the long and the short of it, the whole rough plank of it, was that I was not invited to his wedding, not because he didn't love me, not because he didn't want me there, not because of anything I had done in the past that we hadn't spoken about already, cried about already, patched up like an old chair we couldn't quite part with, but because her father, the man I had met exactly twice in a driveway lined with glassy river stones and a front porch swinging like a promise, had made it a condition, had set in as many words that the guest list had to reflect the tone of the event, meaning the people had to belong to the picture he was paying for. And that's someone like me, a man who worked with his hands in a shop that used to be a carport, who wore the same boots to church and to work, who had a pickup truck older than the groom himself, would pull the picture out of balance. And there would be questions, and there would be gossip, and there would be that hush people pretend is reverence, but really is judgment. And so for the sake of the evening, for the sake of harmony and optics and peace, I should sit this one out. And after my son said all that, he waited with the quiet of someone holding a board while you sight down its length to check the warp, praying you won't see what you already feel in your fingers. I walked to the back door of the shop and pushed it open with my hip and looked out at the yard, which was just a rectangle of grass determined to be greener than the week before, bordered by the fence I built when he was 13 and had friends over who played like the world was a trampoline. And I remembered the afternoon we put that first section up together, me showing him how to set a line so the posts would march like soldiers and not wander, and how he had said with all the certainty of a kid who had never met a mortgage that he would build a house with his own hands one day, a small one maybe, with a kitchen full of light and a backyard where his dad could come over and grill whenever he wanted. And I leaned against the door frame and let the memory and the present mix like sawdust and rain. Okay, I said finally, because I am not a man who argues with a decision that has already been made in a room I wasn't invited to, and because I could hear it wasn't truly his decision, not the kind that grows from your spine and your gut. This one had come from outside and wrapped around him like ivy, and he was trying to breathe through it. He said my name very quietly and asked if I hated him, and I told him I didn't. I couldn't. Not now. Not ever. But I was going to need some time, and I would probably say things in my own head that a father isn't proud of, and I would probably feel things that would make me ashamed later. But for now, I was going to finish the table that had to go out by Friday, and he was going to do what he thought he had to do. And we were going to keep talking when the dust settled, because dust always settles. That's what dust does. And he said he was sorry. He was so sorry. And I said I heard him. And when we hung up, I didn't move for a long time. Just stood there listening to the air compressor kick on and off like it was breathing for both of us. In the kind of story you hear at a bar, this is where the father throws the phone against the wall and storms into the big house to pound on the door, or he writes a letter sharp enough to cut glass, or he drinks himself into a brave rage, or he goes quiet and turns into a stone around which the family river runs. But I am not a man who lives like a headline. I am a man who sands and waits and sands some more, because that is how you fix things that will be touched every day, and the hand knows when the surface is true even if the eye is fooled. So I picked up the sander and worked until my arms hummed, and when I stopped, the phone buzzed again, and it was a text from him, a photo of the invitation, creamy paper with raised letters, all the old language bent into shape for their names, and at the bottom a small gold symbol like a promise and a price tag, and under it he had written, "I wanted you to see it anyway." And for a second it made me laugh, the way we try to soften blows with gestures that only underline their edges. I thought about sending back a thumbs up, or a heart, or some sentence like, "Proud of you," which is true in about 100 ways that anyone with a ledger of our life would understand, and false in a very immediate way that I couldn't swallow without choking. So I set the phone down and went inside to the house that holds its heat in winter and keeps cool in summer, because I learned my way around caulk and insulation the same year. I learned how to be alone without being lonely, and I made coffee, though it was 3 in the afternoon and I shouldn't have. And I sat at the kitchen table and opened the drawer where I keep the things that don't fit in sensible categories, like old ticket stubs and the key to a storage unit I no longer rent, and a paperclip chain a little boy made for me during a thunderstorm that cut the power and made everything feel like a camping trip. And tucked in with those was the check I had written last week for the rehearsal dinner contribution I had offered to make. Nothing flashy, just the kind of sum that meant I'd picked up a few extra jobs in the spring and put off buying new tires a bit longer. And I looked at the numbers as if they could tell me something about what matters and what doesn't. And then I tore it into 4 pieces like a ritual I didn't know the rules for. And I put the pieces back in the drawer and shut it gently. That night, I didn't sleep so much as listen to the house settling itself on its bones. And in the morning, I did what I always do, which was to keep going, because there was a delivery to make and bills that don't care about your heart. And on the way to the client, I passed the florist on Maple Avenue where the window was a riot of peonies and eucalyptus. And there in the center was a framed sign announcing they were the official vendor for the Sutton Keller wedding. And the name hit me in the ribs, his name on someone else's banner. And I parked and went inside, because I'm that kind of fool, the kind who wants to touch the hot stove again just to confirm it is as hot as he remembers. And the woman at the counter had the brisk kindness of someone who wakes up before dawn to handle things that wilt in hours and still believes it's worth it. And I asked about a bouquet that would be appropriate for a son on the day he gets married. And she smiled and said they actually had a special, designed for fathers to give their sons at the rehearsal dinner: eucalyptus for steadiness, white dahlias for dignity, and a single blue thistle for honesty. And I said that sounded perfect. And then I said, "He won't be having one from me." And I told her more than I should have, because sometimes you tell a stranger the thing you can't yet bring yourself to say to your own reflection. And she listened, and then asked me if I wanted to leave a note to be tucked anonymously into a centerpiece. A message that would be read by the table, but never traced back to the hand that wrote it. And I said I would think about it. And I walked out with my hands empty and my chest full of the kind of ache you can't point to on a chart. I expected to go home and disappear into work, to lose the outlines of myself in the rote mercy of sanding and finishing. But the world doesn't always respect your plan to suffer in private. And as I turned the corner onto my street, there was a white SUV I recognized from the driveway with the river stones, and leaning against it in a suit that said he wore suits like other men wore sweaters was her father, the man who had decided I was an error to be corrected before the picture could be taken. And he looked at me the way a landlord looks at a leaky ceiling, with measured annoyance, like he couldn't believe the building had the nerve to age on his watch. He said my name the way people do when they've practiced it to make sure it sounds friendly. And then he asked if we could talk, just a brief chat among men who wanted what was best for the same boy. And I told him yes, because I was raised to be polite to my elders and my enemies. And we stood in the thin shadow of my maple tree while he explained in careful phrases that sounded like he tried them out in front of a mirror that my absence was nothing personal, just an issue of cohesion and expectation, that weddings were performances whether we admitted it or not, that investors and partners and family friends would be there, people who had a caricature in their heads of what the groom's background looked like, and that my presence might invite questions they didn't have answers for, or answers they didn't want to give, and that if I could find it in my heart to see the larger picture I would understand. And here he paused and met my eyes like a man measuring a doorway, that there would be arrangements later to ensure I felt included in other ways, perhaps a small reception just for our side, a gesture that would go a long way towards smoothing any hurt feelings. I waited until he was done, and then I told him that once, when my son was 9, he had been obsessed with a magic kit he got for Christmas, and he'd learned to palm a coin and make it reappear behind my ear, and the trick drove me wild with joy because I could see the seam and still pretended I couldn't. And what he was asking me to do now was the same thing, to pretend not to see the scene, to clap and smile while he made me vanish. And that I was not going to do that. I was not going to call. In absence of favor, I was not going to write a thank you note to the man who had turned me into a problem, and he listened with the patience of a person who believes he will close the deal anyway. And then he said he understood, and that he hoped time would soften this, and that in the long run we would all be family, and this little bump would be a funny story. And I said that if he was set on the picture looking a certain way, he should take it quickly, because pictures lie, but they don't lie forever. He left without shaking my hand, and I went inside and stood in the hallway where the photos of my son growing up lined the wall like a slow-motion film. The missing front teeth and the first Little League jersey and the graduation cap tilted like a question, and I tried to imagine taking them down the way some people do when a person they love dies or moves to the other side of a fight, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't even touch the frames. So I went back to the shop and stared at the table, like it might give me an answer, and the answer it gave me was to keep moving. So I loaded it carefully into the truck and drove across town to Mrs. Valdez, who had saved tips for 2 years to replace the sagging dining table her husband had bought when they first got married. And I carried it into her apartment and put it where it would hold 100 little dinners and 5 big ones. And she cried in that quiet way people cry when they've taught themselves not to make a scene. And she pressed a bag of tamales into my hand like a secret. And I took them and said thank you and left with my throat tight. I tell you about the table and the tamales because that is how life usually balances itself. A little grace next to a little meanness, the sweetness and the embarrassment of being seen. And because if I only tell you the part about the man in the suit and the phone call, you will think the world went dark and stayed that way. And it didn't. It never does. There are always these small lamps along the path. They don't make the day come any faster, but they keep you from walking into a ditch, and I held on to them that evening when my sister came by with a bottle of wine and the kind of look that means the news has spread, because news like this is lighter than smoke and heavier than lead. It goes everywhere and sits on everything. And she hugged me and said the words people say, that he would come around, that the wedding wasn't the marriage, that the first year with in-laws was a negotiation, that once there were kids the real family would show itself. And I nodded because I wanted to believe her. And then she said, in that blunt way only a sister can get away with, that I had to decide if I was going to fight this or forgive it, because those were the only 2 roads and the middle ground would just grind me down. And I told her I didn't know yet, and I meant it. 3 days later, an envelope arrived that looked like a bill but wasn't, and inside was a liability waiver from the venue asking me to acknowledge that I wouldn't attend, that I wouldn't attempt to enter the property that weekend, that I understood the private nature of the event, and that any violation would be met with prosecution. And it had my name and address printed correctly and a polite cover letter that called it a standard precaution. And I stood there with the paper in my hands, feeling the temperature drop in a way the thermostat couldn't measure, and I signed it, because I am not a man who gives other men an excuse to call the police. And when I put it back in the envelope to mail it, my hand shook for the first time since the phone call. The first real argument between me and my son came after that, not because of the paper itself, but because of the way it made the private insult public, turned an ache into a notice, and I called him and told him that sending me something like that was not a standard precaution in our life, that in our life we looked each other in the eyes and said what we meant, and he said he hadn't known they would do that it was the venue's lawyer who handled all of it, that it was out of his hands. And those words, out of my hands, made something in me twist, because I had spent 20 years putting things into his hands, tools and keys and ideas about how to stand up and how to bow down and when to do each. And now here he was telling me that the rules of a party could reach farther than the reach of his spine. We didn't yell. We don't yell. It's not how we argue. We just sank into a silence that frayed around the edges. And finally he said, as if he were reading a line on a prompt card, that in the long run it would be worth it, because this family he was marrying into would open doors, would change things, would make their life easier, that he was tired of watching me count the dollars before ordering coffee, tired of seeing tires go bald before I replaced them, tired of the way I brought a small calculator to the hardware store like I was planning a moon landing. And he said he wanted something different for his kids, and he said this as if he wasn't my kid, and I told him that I had wanted something different for him too, that this was it. That different doesn't always mean better. Sometimes it just means shiny, and shiny peels. 2 weeks passed like a badly edited movie. Jump cuts between moments when I remembered to breathe and moments when I forgot how. And in the middle of that, the bride herself, Lila, called me late one evening. And I admit I didn't want to pick up because it felt like agreeing to the terms of a game I hadn't signed up to play. But I did, because she is kind in ways that soften her sharp edges. And she said she was embarrassed, that she had argued, that she had lost, that her father was set on this, that she was set on the marriage anyway, that she loved my son and didn't love this and didn't know how to hold both ideas at once. And I told her I heard her and I believed her. And I told her that when people say they love you but can't make room for where you came from, they love a version of you who doesn't exist yet. And that is a hard way to start a life. And she cried quietly. And I didn't know whether the tears were for me or for herself, which is how it goes most of the time in families. The unexpected event, if you're still listening for it, happened on a Tuesday that smelled like cut grass and rain in the distance. The kind of afternoon where you look up and think the sky is holding its breath, because I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and it wasn't her father or the venue or a florist with a compromise. It was a reporter from the local paper, the one that runs stories about fundraisers and retirements and occasionally a scandal about a zoning variance. And she said she was working on a feature about the Sutton Keller wedding, because apparently the father had given a large donation to the Arts Center in exchange for the right to put his name on the new wing and hold the reception there. And she was wondering if I'd like to share a human interest angle about a father's perspective on watching his son marry into a prominent family. And I almost laughed. I really did. Not because it was funny, but because the timing was so exact it felt like a test to see whether I still recognized myself. And I told her no. Thank you. I would not like to share any angle. I would like to remain a circle. And she said she understood. And then she said, before we hung up, that she had heard a rumor that there was complicated family dynamics at play. And the words sounded like they'd been sprayed with hairspray, stiff and gleaming. And I said, every family is complicated. And she said, of course, and we ended the call there. But the fact of it hovered over the week like a drone, buzzing. Now here is the part where something in me shifted from hurt to action, not revenge in the movie sense. No elaborate scheme with a tuxedo and a timed speech. Just a simple decision to tell the truth in the place where it would matter the most to me, which is to say, directly to my son, not through papers or proxies or small humiliations. And so I made a plan to see him, and I picked the day carefully, not the bachelor weekend. God help me. I didn't want to imagine what that would be, nor the last rush of errands, but a day in the middle when it felt like everyone might be tired and honest. We met at a diner we used to go to after his Little League games, a place where the waitress still called everyone sweetheart, and the pancakes tasted like Saturdays, and the pitcher of coffee was always just on the edge of burnt. And I sat in the booth and ran my thumb along the carved initials in the wood and waited for him. And when he walked in, I stood because he was my son. And fathers stand up for their sons even when the sons have sat them down. And we hugged with the stiffness of men who are trying not to break. And we ordered eggs because it gave our hands something to do. And I told him that I would not come to the wedding even if they changed their minds at the last minute, because I would not be the man who lets himself be added like an afterthought when a place card opens up, that I would not help them feel generous by accepting a thing that should have been mine outright. And he looked like I'd slapped him and then like I'd kissed him, because there was relief in not having to keep hoping I'd cave, and grief in the sentence of it. And we sat there with that, and then he said, very quietly, that he had always wanted to be the kind of man who invited everyone to the table, and that he didn't know when he had started to believe the table belonged to someone else. We paid and walked to the parking lot. And if you want a big cinematic moment here, the skies did not open, no music swelled, just the caw of a bird and the hum of a delivery truck. And I held his face in my hands for a second the way you do with a child who needs to know where he begins and ends. And then I let go because he is not a child, and I am not a man who clings. And he got in his car and drove away, and I stood there watching my reflection in his back windshield shrink, and then I went home. The last week before the wedding crawled along and sprinted at the same time, and I got through it by making things useful, by repairing a neighbor's wobbly porch step and rehanging the gate at the community garden, and sorting the piles in my shop that had become altars to the idea that someday I would need a very particular screw. And I didn't look at the calendar because I didn't need to. My body knew what day it was by the way my chest felt tight the night before, like an animal that knows. A storm is coming without seeing the radar. And on the morning itself, I got up early and made coffee and drank it on the back steps like any other Saturday. And then I put on my good shirt, the one I wear to weddings and funerals and graduations and the nicest restaurants I can afford, and I drove not to the arts center with the new wing, but to the river where I used to take him to fish. And I walked the path to the bend where the water slows and the rocks make a riffle that sounds like someone you love laughing in the next room. And I sat on the big flat stone that has known both our weight and watched the light change on the surface like someone turning pages. I had brought something with me, not a gift wrapped in paper and bow, not a letter to be delivered by some well-meaning cousin who would feel caught in the middle, but the watch my father left me, a plain stainless steel thing that had been with me through the years when money was whatever you had in your pocket and the years when I almost believed I'd made it. And I held it in my palm, and I told the river the story of my boy, the story of all the Saturdays and the bad report cards and the time he lied about breaking a neighbor's window, and then confessed without being asked because he couldn't keep the lie inside his bones. And the time we drove 6 hours straight to see the ocean for the first time because he said he didn't believe it was as big as people said, and then he stood there with his shoes in his hands and cried because it was bigger, and I asked the river to carry some of my words downstream, to wear them smooth. And I said out loud that I forgave him for being young and for being afraid and for wanting something easier than the life he saw me live. And then I said the truer thing, which is that I did not forgive him yet, not fully, and that I wasn't sure when I would. And I put the watch back in my pocket, and I sat there until the light shifted from gold to ordinary. I don't know what they did at the Arts Center, what toasts were made, what songs were played, what speeches landed, and what speeches curled up like leaves under a heat lamp. I don't know if anyone noticed the empty seat that hadn't been saved for me, because I was never on the list. I don't know if her father smiled the smile of a man who had arranged the picture exactly as he wanted it. I don't know if my son stood in a small corner of his new life and felt the echo of me and looked away. I only know that later, when the sky was darker than the river and the frogs were singing like they always do, my phone buzzed, and it was a photo from an unknown number, and in it my son was dancing with my sister, and my sister's eyes were on the camera like she was telling me something without words, and he was laughing. And it made me feel two things at once: pride because he looked like Joy had borrowed his face for the evening, and loss because I was not in the room where Joy was making rounds. For a few weeks after the wedding, I worked like a man trying to outpace himself. Orders piled up, and I took them all. Benches, shelves, frames, even small toys for the church bazaar. Anything that kept my hands moving and my mind half occupied. At night, I'd sit on the back porch with a beer and listen to the crickets. That was our sound when he was little. We'd sit out there, him cross-legged with a blanket over his shoulders, telling stories about the stars like we owned the night. Now it just felt like an old recording I couldn't turn off. Then came the first letter. Not from him. That would have been easier to hate or to forgive. No, this one came from the same white envelope stock as the waiver. Only this time it was embossed with the Sutton family crest. I didn't know families still had crests. The letter thanked me, in the formal voice of a lawyer or an executive assistant, for respecting the arrangements during the wedding and helping preserve the dignity and decorum of the occasion. There was a check inside, $2,000. I don't know if it was meant as a gesture of gratitude or hush money. Either way, I tore it in half, then in quarters, then eighths, and dropped it in the trash. I remember laughing a little, which scared me. There's a kind of laughter that comes from the edge of something sharp. The next day, I drove out past the mill to deliver a coffee table to an old couple who lived near the quarry. On my way back, I saw the big new billboard they'd put up, a glossy shot of the Sutton Keller wedding party in front of the Arts Center. My son was there in the middle, clean-cut, confident, with his arm around Lila. He looked happy. I should have felt proud, at least that he'd made it into a life that looked like that. But what hit me harder was the corner of the billboard, where they'd cropped out the shadow of the photographer. Just the faintest hint of another shape, erased to keep the picture perfect. It reminded me too much of how I'd been cropped out too. I didn't tell anyone about the billboard. Not even my sister, though she stopped by most weekends now, pretending she just wanted to borrow tools or drop off leftovers. Everyone knew something had cracked, but nobody wanted to be the one to poke it. She'd bring up my son sometimes. Always soft, always cautious. "He called me last week," she said once, while washing dishes. "Says they're settling in okay. New house, near her parents." I just nodded. He mentioned you, she added. I waited. Said he's still figuring out how to talk to you again. I wanted to say I didn't need figuring out. I was right here, same address, same phone, same father he'd always had. But I just said, good, and left it there. That night, I got a call I wasn't expecting. It wasn't from him, not exactly. It was from a number that turned out to be Lila's. Her voice was quiet, like she was calling from a bathroom with the door closed. He's not doing well, she said. He's trying, but it's complicated. I told her I didn't need details, but she kept talking anyway. You should know it's not what he thought it would be, she said. The business deals, the family events, all that. There's pressure. And then, almost whispering, they make him sign things like agreements. About image, about representation, about what he can and can't say publicly. That stuck with me. What do you mean, can't say publicly? I asked. It's part of their company structure, she said, like that explained it. His father-in-law runs this foundation, this conglomerate thing. They're into technology, defense contracts, research grants. I don't even understand it all. But when you're tied to them, there are expectations, privacy clauses, non-disclosure stuff. It's not just a family, it's like a machine. A machine. The word echoed in my head for days after, because I'd always believed life was something built, something shaped, not engineered by someone else. When you build a table, you feel every inch of it. You sand the grain until it warms under your hands. But a machine, that's something that moves without feeling, something that keeps running whether you like it or not. A week later, I started noticing something strange. I got a call from my bank saying there'd been an inquiry into my accounts, not a withdrawal, just a security verification. Then I got a letter from my health insurance saying my information had been updated, except I hadn't updated anything. Then an email, an invitation from the Keller Foundation to an open house event about their new innovation center, the one tied to advancing human potential. It felt random at first, but my gut told me different. You spend enough years reading wood grain, and you start to recognize patterns everywhere. The event was free, downtown. I went. I told myself it was curiosity, not pride, that drove me there. But pride has a lot of disguises. The center was a sleek glass cube with walls that looked too clean to belong to this town. Inside, everything gleamed. White, chrome, polished concrete. There were panels showing research about human optimization, language that made me uneasy. One display showed a timeline of collaborative studies on genetic behavior patterns and adaptive cognition. Another had photos of families, case studies, it said, showing how upbringing and environmental factors shaped measurable outcomes. And there, on one of the walls, in smaller print than the rest, was a quote from Thomas Keller himself. "We're not improving people, we're refining humanity." It was the kind of phrase you could put on a poster and make people clap without understanding what it meant. But it made something inside me shift. Refining humanity. Like sandpaper on a soul. At the end of the exhibit, they were handing out pamphlets and collecting contact info. I gave a fake email. One of the assistants, a young man in a sharp suit, same age my son had been when he left home for college, handed me a brochure and smiled too wide. "It's a beautiful thing, sir," he said, "to see progress happen in your own family." I frowned. "What do you mean, my family?" He nodded toward the board behind him. "Your son's part of the next cohort. Didn't you know?" I took the pamphlet from him, but before I could ask more, someone else pulled him aside. I left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the brochure under the lamp. On the second page was a section titled Pilot Program, Generational Integration. It talked about select families contributing to a longitudinal study of genetic resilience and behavioral inheritance. There was a list of donors: Keller, Sutton, others. And at the bottom, in small type, in partnership with the Adaptive Mind Initiative, a division of the Keller Research Group. I'd never heard of it before. I started digging. The local library computer was slow, but it got me far enough. The Keller Group had contracts with the government, universities, and something that looked like a private lab near the old airfield. Most of their projects were vague: biometric modeling, neural architecture, behavioral synchronization. But a few had public reports attached, and one phrase came up again and again: controlled evolutionary testing through familial lineage mapping. I didn't understand most of it, but I knew how it made me feel. Like someone had been taking notes on my family without asking. 2 days later, Lila called again. This time she was crying. I could barely make out the words. "He's been different lately," she said. "They keep him working late, always on calls. And sometimes he forgets things, little things, but strange things. He called me by your name once, and then didn't remember saying it." Her voice broke. "They say it's stress, but I found something. In his office. A file with his name on it. Inside were reports, like medical reports, from years before we met. Dates I know don't match anything he's ever told me. Your name was on some of the forms too." I sat there gripping the phone, the same hand that had held a hammer steady 1,000 times, now shaking. "What kind of reports?" "I don't know," she said. "There were references to something called Project Orpheus. Does that mean anything to you?" It didn't, but the name stuck in my throat like a splinter. That night, I drove back out to the airfield. The lab building she'd mentioned was there, long, low, almost invisible from the road, behind a fence with motion sensors. The sign said Keller Research Annex. There were no windows, just vents and a few small lights. I parked down the road and watched. Delivery trucks came and went, no markings. Around midnight, a van pulled up, and for a second, through the gate, I saw a man step out who looked like my son. The way he walked, the way he rubbed the back of his neck, it was him. But then the light hit his face, and it wasn't. It was someone else. Someone with his exact build, same haircut, same posture. It felt like seeing a ghost of a man still alive. I drove home shaking. When I got there was an email waiting, from my son this time. Just a single line. "Dad, please stop looking into them." No signature. No "love you." Just that. I called his number. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I sent a text. "What do you mean? What's going on?" No response. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed I was back at the river. Only it wasn't water running past me. It was static, like from a TV, and every time I reached in, I saw flashes of faces that looked like mine. The next morning, I decided to go see him. No warnings, no calls. Just drive up to that perfect house near her parents and knock on the door. But when I got there, the driveway was empty. Curtains drawn. Mail piled up. I walked around back and saw something that stopped me cold. A small white box mounted by the porch light. At first, I thought it was just a new security system. Then I noticed the logo, Keller Adaptive Systems. The same company from the brochures. When I leaned closer, I could hear a faint hum, like the sound old radios make when tuned between stations. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe the same stubborn streak that makes a man test a beam twice before trusting it. But I reached up and pried the cover off. Inside wasn't a motion sensor. It was a camera, a small black lens and a blinking light. I don't know who it was watching, but I knew it wasn't burglars. That's when I heard the voice. From behind me. Calm, firm, polite. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the property." Two men stood at the edge of the yard. Suits again. Identical, even down to the ties. They looked like accountants who could break your jaw without wrinkling their sleeves. One of them smiled. "You must be Mr. Sutton." I nodded. "We'd appreciate it if you didn't disturb the installation. It's for security, your son's safety, as well as his wife's." "Then why is your logo on it?" I asked. He didn't answer that. "Mr. Keller values discretion," he said instead. "And he asked me to extend an invitation. He'd like to speak with you privately." I should have walked away. Every good instinct told me to. But pride and fear for my son are bad companions. I said yes. The meeting was at the Keller offices downtown. High floor, glass everywhere. The kind of place where you can see the whole town spread out beneath you, like something you already own. Keller himself was older than I remembered. Thinner, his hair silver like he'd painted it that way. He greeted me with that corporate charm that never quite reaches the eyes. "Mr. Sutton," he said, shaking my hand. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." I stayed standing. "Where's my son?" He smiled faintly. "At work. He's quite valuable to us now. You should be proud." "Proud doesn't cover it," I said. "What's Project Orpheus?" That wiped the smile off his face, but only for a second. "That's not a public initiative," he said. "I'm curious where you heard that name." "Doesn't matter. I just want to know what you're doing to him." "Doing to him?" Keller leaned back, folding his hands. "Mr. Sutton, we're helping him. Your son volunteered to be part of a pioneering study, understanding how human behavior and cognition can be enhanced through controlled environmental factors. He's safe. In fact, he's thriving." "He's not thriving," I said. His wife says he forgets things. He's not himself. Adaptation takes time, Keller said. Change is difficult, but necessary. Some people are built to evolve faster. Your son is one of them. I felt my voice rise. You talk like you own him. He smiled again, smaller this time. In a way, we do. Not legally, of course. But when someone signs a contract with our program, they become part of something larger than themselves. You should be honored. His potential is a reflection of your lineage. My lineage. I repeated. Yes, that's the fascinating part, he said, almost eager now. Your genetic profile was part of our early studies, Mr. Sutton. Back when your son was still in school. You may not remember certain medical screenings, data collection through public health databases, blood donations. Small things, but together they create a map. You see, our work focuses on inherited behavioral traits, resilience, adaptability, moral decision-making. You, for example, show unusually high markers for self-control and empathy under duress. Traits your son carries. Traits we can study, replicate, enhance. I just stared at him. You've been using us for your research? Using is such a blunt word, he said, sighing. Think of it as contribution. You should be proud of your legacy. We're shaping the next evolution of humankind, Mr. Sutton, and your family is part of that. He stood, signaling the conversation was over. Don't involve yourself further. It would only complicate things for him. For both of you. I left without another word. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely press the elevator button. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the dark, staring at the boutonniere box on the shelf, and thought about everything Keller had said. About lineage, contribution, data. About my son's blank look in that photo. About the men at the house, the cameras, the forgotten memories. It felt bigger than betrayal now. It felt like theft, not just of a relationship, but of who we were. The next morning, I went back to the river. Same spot, same rock. I watched the current until the noise in my head slowed. Somewhere out there, my son was trapped in a life that wasn't his, surrounded by people who spoke like scientists dissecting souls. I didn't know how to reach him yet, but I knew I would. Because a father can forgive a lot. The words, the absence, even the silence, but not the idea that his child has been turned into a project. And as the sun came up over the water, something in me hardened, not into hate, but into purpose. I didn't have their power or their money, but I had something they'd never understand. Time, patience, and a truth I was willing to sand down until it fit the shape of the world again. That was the morning I decided this wasn't over. And for the first time since the phone call in the shop, I felt the smallest spark of hope. Not the soft kind, but the kind that burns. A few days after I met Keller, I stopped answering the phone. I let messages pile up like sawdust under a saw, meaning to sweep them later, but never getting around to it. The world outside the shop kept turning, but inside, time felt warped. Every sound, the rasp of sandpaper, the thump of the planer, had its own accusation hidden in it. I wasn't sure what to do next. Keller had made it clear I wasn't supposed to get involved, and that was the problem. The minute someone like him tells you to stay out of it, you know you have to dig deeper. But I didn't know where to start. All I had was that name, Project Orpheus, and a gut feeling that my son was in over his head. The first break came from a place I didn't expect. It was a Wednesday afternoon, gray and wet, the kind of day that makes the whole town smell like concrete. I was closing up when someone knocked on the shop door. I opened it to find a woman standing there in a tan raincoat, clutching a folder under her arm. She looked to be in her 40s, with the kind of face that looked both tired and alert, like someone who'd spent years watching people lie for a living. "Mr. Sutton?" she asked. "That's me. My name's Mara Hale. I'm an independent journalist. I used to work for the Chronicle downtown. I think we should talk." I hesitated. If this is about the wedding, that story's old news. She shook her head. "Not the wedding. The Keller Foundation. You went to one of their events last month." That made my stomach drop. "How do you know that?" "I saw you there," she said. "You were looking at the Orpheus display. I was taking photos for a piece that got killed before it ran." She held up the folder. "They pulled funding for our paper after that. I lost my job." I let her in. She sat at the small table near the window, spreading out papers, printouts, screenshots, internal memos that looked half legal, half scientific. Her fingers shook just enough to tell me she'd been carrying this around too long. "What is Orpheus?" I asked. It started as a behavioral genetics study, she said. 10 years ago, Keller's research group got a grant to analyze generational traits, decision-making under pressure, emotional regulation, that sort of thing. It was supposed to be anonymized data from public records. But then they expanded. They started targeting specific families with long histories in the region. Families that had strong community reputations, but limited means. Easy to monitor, easy to pressure. I stared at her. Families like mine. Exactly. They collect data through routine things, school health forms, DNA tests at hospitals, even insurance paperwork. Most people never notice. But a few years back, they added a new phase. Direct involvement. Controlled environments. She flipped a page. Your son's name came up in one of the internal files I got hold of. He was flagged as a high resilience subject. High resilience, I said, tasting the words. That's what they call it when someone survives being poor. She gave a small, sad smile. Pretty much. I asked how she'd gotten the files. A whistleblower, she said. Someone inside the Keller group who wanted the truth out. He disappeared before we could publish. I've been looking for proof he's still alive. Her voice faltered then, just slightly. And that's when I realized she wasn't just chasing a story. She was chasing someone she cared about. Who was he to you? I asked. She looked down at her hands. My brother. We sat there a while without talking, just the sound of rain hitting the roof. Then she said quietly, he worked maintenance at one of their labs near the airfield. Same place you went. He told me once they were doing something that scared him. Something with memory patterns, identity tracking, genetic mapping. The kind of work that makes you question what it means to be human. Then one day he stopped calling. They said he quit. But his apartment was left exactly as it was. Coffee on the counter, phone on the charger, bed unmade. Her voice cracked on that last word, and I saw the weight she'd been carrying. I also saw in her something familiar. Someone who couldn't let go, no matter how much it hurt. That was when I knew this was my ally. We agreed to work together, quietly. No calls, no emails. We'd meet in person, swap information, see what fit. I didn't know if she could help me get my son back, but at least she believed me, and that was worth more than I'd had in months. The first thing we did was follow the money. Keller's company was too big to trace directly, but Mara knew how to dig through shells and subsidiaries. We spent evenings in the public library, huddled over ancient computers, cross-referencing tax records. What we found wasn't a straight line, but a web. Foundations donating to research centers that funneled grants to local hospitals, which in turn sold anonymized patient data to Keller Adaptive Systems. The same logo I'd seen on that device outside my son's house showed up again and again. They're not just running experiments, Mara said one night. They're building profiles, behavioral fingerprints. They know who's loyal, who's likely to comply, who's easy to manipulate. Your son fits a pattern. They select people with high social intelligence, but low economic leverage. People who want to prove themselves. I wanted to defend him, but she wasn't wrong. My son had always wanted to fix things, to prove he was better than the small life we'd had. Keller had seen that and offered him a ladder. Around midnight, I drove her home. She lived in a cramped apartment over a laundromat, the kind of place that always smells like detergent and steam. Before she got out of the truck, she said, "Be careful who you talk to. Keller's reach goes deep." I told her I wasn't afraid. She smiled faintly. "You should be." A week later, Lila showed up at my door. She looked pale, thinner. She said she couldn't stay long. Someone was waiting in the car. But she had to tell me something. "They're moving him," she said. "Out of state. Some new assignment. He didn't even tell me until last night." "Did he want to go?" She shook her head. "They said it's mandatory. He'll be gone for months." He tried to argue, but Keller told him it was part of his contract. When I pressed him, he just stared at me like he didn't understand what I was asking. I felt something tighten in my chest. Where are they taking him? Somewhere in Virginia. A research retreat, they called it. But there's no address, just a code on the paperwork, or to field facility. Mara's notes had mentioned an or to site once, connected to Orpheus. I wrote it down. "Did you sign anything?" I asked. "They tried to make me. Confidentiality forms." I refused. "Good," I said. "Hold on to that spine. You might need it." She started crying then. "He's not the same, Mr. Sutton. He sleeps with the lights on now. He checks the windows. Sometimes he wakes up and asks me what year it is." I put a hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing coming here." Before she left, she handed me a flash drive. He told me to give you this if anything happened. The next day, Mara and I plugged it into one of the library computers. Inside were audio files, recordings of my son talking. Most were short, like journal entries. His voice sounded tired but calm. Day 3, they say adaptation is a process of letting go. I'm trying to remember what I was supposed to hold on to. Day 10, they keep asking about my father, about how he handles stress, about what he fears. I don't understand why that matters. Day 22, I think they're testing memory. They ask me to recall things that didn't happen. Sometimes I almost believe them. Mara looked at me, eyes wide. He's inside the program, she said. They're mapping emotional inheritance, seeing if they can alter it. I could barely breathe. He's not a lab rat, I said. He's my son. I know, she whispered. And they've already crossed the line. We spent the next few days trying to trace the facility code. Or, 2 turned out to be near a decommissioned military site in the Virginia mountains. It wasn't on any public map, but there were supply routes registered under a defense logistics company that matched the Keller Group's shell records. We couldn't just drive up there. It was gated and guarded. We needed proof, something undeniable we could hand to someone who'd listen. Mara had an idea. There's an ex-contractor who used to do logistics for Keller. He lives 2 towns over. Goes by Don Riggs. If anyone knows what's moving in and out of that facility, it's him. We found Riggs in a bar that smelled like motor oil and regret. Big guy, ex-military, with a limp that told its own story. He was suspicious at first, but when Mara mentioned Keller, he froze. You didn't hear that name from me, he said. We already did, I told him. We just need to know what's happening out at or 2. He laughed without humor. You don't want to know. I have a son there, I said. That's exactly why I need to know. Something in my voice must have convinced him. He ordered another drink and leaned closer. They call it a research site, but it's more like a training ground. Not soldiers, subjects. They run psychological endurance drills. Keep people awake for days, test their reactions under stress, measure compliance. Some volunteers, some less voluntary. They say it's all ethical, but nobody checks. Keller's got contracts with agencies that don't exist on paper. Agencies? Mara asked. He nodded. Private intelligence, biotech startups, government programs that got retired and reborn under new names. You didn't hear it from me, but or 2 is where they test integration, how far they can push identity before it breaks. I wanted to hit him for saying it so casually. Instead, I just asked, can you get us in? He looked at me a long time. Not inside, but I can show you where the supply trucks load. You might catch something worth photographing. Just don't get caught. 2 nights later, we drove to the mountains. The road wound higher until cell service disappeared. Around midnight, we reached a ridge overlooking the facility. It looked small from above, just a cluster of concrete buildings, floodlights cutting across the fog. Every hour, a truck rolled in and out through a guarded gate. We waited in silence, cameras ready. At one point, I thought I saw him. A figure stepping from a truck, head shaved, wearing a gray jumpsuit. The posture, the shoulders, it could have been my son. I started forward, but Mara grabbed my arm. Don't, she whispered. If they see us, we lose everything. I stood there shaking, torn between instinct and reason. Then I saw the guards lead the figure inside. The door shut. Gone. We stayed until dawn, taking photos, recording times, marking truck numbers. When we finally left, I felt hollow, like someone had carved out the part of me that used to believe the world ran on fairness. Back home, we gathered everything we had. The recordings, the documents, the photos. Mara planned to send them to a contact she still trusted at a national paper. If this goes public, she said, they can't bury it. But Keller was faster. That afternoon, 2 men showed up at my shop. Same type as before, black suits, calm smiles. One handed me an envelope. Cease and desist order, he said. You're in possession of proprietary materials belonging to Keller Adaptive Systems. Return them immediately. I asked what would happen if I didn't. The other man smiled. We'd hate to see your son's situation deteriorate further. They left without another word. I called Mara immediately, but her number was disconnected. I drove to her apartment. The door was open, lights off, papers scattered on the floor. Her computer was gone. So was she. I don't know if she ran or was taken. The landlord said 2 men in dark coats came that morning, said they were federal auditors. They boxed up her things and left in a black SUV. I spent the night in my truck outside the laundromat, waiting, hoping she'd come back. She never did. The next morning, I got a letter. No return address, just my name. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photo. The photo showed Mara, alive, sitting at a cafe somewhere sunny, smiling toward the camera. The paper said, "She's safe. Stop digging. Trust the process." I burned it, but something inside me had changed. Before, I'd been angry. Now I was focused. If Keller thought fear would stop me, he'd forgotten what kind of man I was. You can scare a man who's still got something to lose. But I'd already lost what mattered. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, listening to the refrigerator hum, and planned. I didn't have Mara's contacts or resources, but I had something better, my son's voice on those recordings. His words were the truth, and truth has a way of finding its own echo. I copied the files onto a dozen cheap drives, labeled each with the same message. If I disappear, publish everything. Then I mailed them to every address I could think of, local papers, online forums, even the courthouse clerk. I knew most of them would ignore it, but one might not. When I was done, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and stood at the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. Somewhere out there, my son was still breathing, still fighting in whatever quiet way he could. And maybe, just maybe, he'd hear the noise I was making. 2 days later, a message appeared in my inbox. No subject, no sender, just a single line. "He's coming home." No explanation, no signature, just that. I didn't know if it was real or bait, but I felt something shift again, a thin thread of hope pulling against the weight of everything else. If he really was coming back, then Act 3, whatever you want to call it, wasn't about rescue anymore. It was about what happens when the person you've been fighting for walks back through your door and you have to face what's left between you. And that's where I'll leave it, because that's where the next storm begins. A father waiting for the knock he's wanted and feared in equal measure, not knowing if the man on the other side will still be his son or just what's left of him. It was late afternoon when the knock came. 3 slow taps, the kind that asked permission instead of assuming it. I'd been sanding a cherrywood dresser, trying not to think, when I heard it. For a second, I just stood there, holding my breath, the fine dust in the air turning the sunlight into smoke. I wiped my hands on a rag, walked to the door, and opened it. He was standing there, my son. Same eyes, same jaw, but leaner now, paler. He wore a gray coat I didn't recognize, and his hair was cut shorter than I'd ever seen it. He looked like a man who'd been living somewhere where time didn't move at the same pace as everywhere else. "Hey, Dad," he said. I tried to answer, but the words didn't come. I just nodded and stepped aside. He walked in slow, like someone testing the floorboards of an old house. The smell of sawdust hit him first. He smiled faintly. "Still smells the same." "Yeah," I said. "Still the same shop." We stood there for a while, not talking, just looking at each other. The silence was heavier than any argument could have been. Finally, I gestured toward the stool by the workbench. "Sit down. You hungry?" He shook his head. "Just coffee, if you've got it." I poured him a cup, the same chipped mug he used to use when he was home from college. He held it with both hands like it was something fragile. Then he looked up at me and said, "I heard you've been asking questions." "I have," I said. Seemed like no one else would. He nodded slowly. "You shouldn't have." I felt the anger rise in me, the kind I'd been sanding down for months. "Don't start that," I said. "Don't tell me what I should or shouldn't have done. They kept you from your own father's house, and then they locked you in whatever that place was. What was I supposed to do? Just keep building furniture and pretend my son didn't exist?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared into the mug. Then he said, "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me how it was." He took a long breath. "At first it was just work. Long hours, lots of travel. Then they asked me to take part in some evaluations, leadership, adaptability, stress management. They said it was about developing better team dynamics. It felt like a promotion, and it was for a while. I was making more money than I ever thought I would. Lila and I bought a house. Everything looked good from the outside." He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. Then they started pushing harder, asking me to make decisions that didn't sit right. They'd test how far I'd go to protect the company line. They called it resilience testing. I told myself it was just corporate nonsense, but it got strange. They'd monitor calls, emails, even our sleep. They said it was for safety, but after a while I realized safety wasn't what they cared about. "What did they care about?" I asked. "Control," he said quietly. seeing how far they could shape someone if they put enough pressure in the right places. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. And you stayed. He met my eyes then. I stayed because I thought it would make me stronger. Because I thought walking away would prove them right, that I wasn't cut out for their world. And maybe because part of me wanted to believe there was a reason for it all, that it was leading somewhere better. I turned away and leaned against the bench. You sound like me when I stayed in my first bad job, thinking I could build something out of scraps. Difference is, no one was rewriting my life behind my back. He flinched at that, and for a second I wanted to take it back. But truth doesn't go back in the bottle once it's out. Why'd you come home? I asked. He looked around the shop, his eyes settling on the half-finished dresser. Because I didn't know where else to go, he said. They let me go this morning. Just told me my role was complete. No warning, no thanks, just a release form and a ride to the airport. That's it. That's it. And Lila? He hesitated. She left 2 weeks ago. Said she needed space. Her father made sure she didn't tell me where. I nodded slowly. The pieces fit too neatly to be coincidence. So you came here? Yeah, he said. I wasn't sure you'd open the door. I almost laughed. Son, after everything, you think I wouldn't open the door? I might not know what to say once you're in it, but I'd always open it. Something in him loosened then. He rubbed his eyes, like he'd been holding himself together for too long. I screwed up, Dad, he said. I let them use me. I let them use all of us. You were trying to build a life, I said. That's not a sin. He shook his head. It's worse when you sell pieces of yourself to do it. I sat down across from him. You didn't sell yourself. You got tricked. There's a difference. He smiled, but it was small and tired. Maybe, but I signed those papers. I shut you out. I made you the enemy because it was easier than admitting I'd already crossed the line. We sat there for a long time, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Then he said, they'll come after you, you know, if you still have any of the files, any of what Mara found. I mailed them out, I said. All over. Can't take them all back now. He looked startled. You did that? I did. They can't silence everybody. He stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. You always were stubborn. Runs in the family, I said. He laughed once, softly, and it sounded like him again, the kid I used to fish with. Then his face changed. He looked toward the window, listening. I heard it too. A car slowing outside, tires on gravel. He stood up fast. They found me. Who? He didn't answer. Just grabbed my arm. If they come in, don't argue. Let them take me. They won't hurt you if you don't fight. Like hell, I said. You think I'm going to watch them drag you out again? He looked desperate now. Please, Dad. You don't know what they can do. I stepped closer. I know exactly what men like them can do. They make you believe you owe them your life when they've already taken it. Before he could answer, there was another knock, sharp this time, impatient. I opened a drawer, pulled out the old hammer I'd had since my apprenticeship. Not as a weapon, just something solid to hold. The knock came again. Mr. Sutton, a voice called. Calm, measured. We're here to speak with your son. I turned to him. What do you want to do? He took a deep breath. I'm done running. He opened the door before I could stop him. 2 men in suits stood on the porch, rain dripping from their coats. The one in front smiled thinly. Mr. Sutton, we're glad you made it home safely. Mr. Keller sends his regards. My son didn't move. I'm not part of your program anymore. The man's smile didn't fade. You signed a confidentiality agreement. That remains in effect. I don't care. The man sighed, like a teacher disappointed in a student. Let's not make this difficult. We just need you to come back and debrief. He stepped forward, but I moved between them. You're not taking him anywhere, I said. The man's eyes flicked to the hammer in my hand. You don't want to interfere, sir. I already did, I said. The day you told him I wasn't good enough to sit at his wedding. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the second man, younger, said quietly, let's just go. It's not worth it. The older one hesitated, then handed my son a card. You'll regret this, he said, and they left. We stood there watching their taillights disappear down the road. My son closed the door and leaned against it, shaking. You shouldn't have done that, he said. Maybe not, I said, but I'm done letting other men decide what happens in this house. He laughed once, dry and broken. You haven't changed. Neither have you, I said, and for the first time it didn't sound like an accusation. That night, he stayed in his old room. I heard him moving around for a while, then it went quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the coffee cup he'd left behind. For the first time in months, the house felt alive again. Not peaceful, never that, but alive. Around midnight, he came back out. He sat down across from me, barefoot, wearing an old sweatshirt I didn't even know I'd kept. He looked younger in it, softer. "I keep thinking about that first fence we built," he said. "How you made me redo it because the posts weren't level." "You hated me for it," I said. "I did, but now I get it. You weren't teaching me to build a fence. You were teaching me to build something that lasts." He looked down at his hands. "I built my life on the wrong foundation." "You can rebuild," I said. He shook his head. "Not all of it. Too many cracks." "Then start smaller," I said. "Build one good thing. The rest will come." He looked up at me, eyes wet. "You still believe in that?" "It's the only thing I've ever believed in." He nodded slowly, and for a while we just sat there, the air thick with all the things we didn't say. Then he reached into his pocket and slid something across the table. It was a small flash drive. "What's this?" "The real data," he said. "Everything they collected. Names, dates, funding trails. If it gets out, Keller's finished." I stared at it. "You kept this?" "I copied it before they shut me out. I was scared to use it. But you're not scared of much." I picked it up, turned it over in my fingers. "What do you want me to do with it?" He smiled faintly. "Whatever feels right. I just can't carry it anymore." He stood then, and I thought he was heading back to bed, but instead he stepped behind me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. Just once, quick and tight. "I'm sorry, Dad." I covered his hand with mine. "I know," I said. "Me too." He left early the next morning. Said he needed to clear his head, maybe find Lila, maybe just drive. I didn't try to stop him. You can't cage a man who's already been trapped. After he left, I went back into the shop. The sunlight was coming through the window in thin golden stripes. On the bench sat the flash drive, small and ordinary, like a nail before it holds a house together. I set it beside the dresser I'd been working on and got back to sanding. Each stroke felt steady now, purposeful. Not because I thought I could fix the world, but because I finally understood what Keller and his kind would never understand. A man isn't the sum of what's taken from him. He's what he chooses to keep. And I would keep this, the memory of my son standing in my doorway, not as a victim or a symbol, but as a man trying to come home. The phone rang once that afternoon, an unfamiliar number. I let it ring, then went back to work. The sound of the sander filled the room, rough at first, then smooth, until the wood felt warm under my palm, ready for another chance. The morning after he left, the house felt different, not empty, exactly, but paused. His room smelled like dust and laundry soap. On the desk was a folded sweatshirt and a note that said, "I'll call when I've got something worth saying." That was him, stubborn even in apology. On the kitchen table sat the flash drive, small and ordinary, holding everything that could ruin the men who'd built their empire on other people's silence. I turned it over in my hand until my reflection blurred in its surface. There was no mystery anymore, just a choice, whether to set the truth free or keep it buried. I went to the river. The water was low and clear, moving slow enough to show the stones underneath. I sat on the rock where we used to fish, rolled the drive between my palms, and listened to the current. I thought about how many people had been part of this. The journalist who vanished, the woman who'd wanted to tell the story but lost her job, my son who'd given more than he understood. I thought about Keller too, and his talk of refining humanity. Maybe he believed it. Maybe he'd just said it enough times to forget what it meant. The river didn't give me an answer. It never does. It just kept going, steady as breath. That night, I wrote 2 letters. One to a national reporter who still chased uncomfortable stories, telling her what I had and how to find the evidence if anything happened to me. The second to Keller himself. I told him I was done being polite, done pretending this was business. I said that if he wanted to protect his name, he'd release my son from every contract, every clause, every threat. I didn't ask for an apology, just a clean end. I sealed both envelopes and set them beside the flash drive. 3 small things, and each one could change everything. I didn't mail them that night. I sat up instead, drinking cold coffee and watching the horizon lighten, thinking about what my sister had said months ago, that the middle ground grinds you down. She was right. I was out of middle ground. At sunrise, I drove into town and parked by the post office. The air smelled like wet asphalt and bread from the bakery next door. I sat there a long time, turning the envelopes in my hands. I could hear the truck behind the building loading mail sacks. In a few minutes, I'd have to decide which world I wanted to wake up in. I wish I could tell you which envelope went into the box. I wish I could say whether the flash drive went with it or stayed in my pocket. But all I'll tell you is that I heard the clank of the lid and felt lighter and heavier at once. And that's the truest description I have for the feeling of doing something you can't take back. When I got home, I called my sister. She didn't ask what I'd done. She just said, "Can you live with it?" And I said I thought I could. She said that was all that mattered. That afternoon, I drove out to Lila's parents' house, thinking maybe she'd know where my son had gone. Her mother opened the door. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of keeping peace no one asked for. She told me Lila had left days ago, no address given. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Whatever you're planning, be sure you can live with the echo." The first act ends quick, but the sound of it lasts. I thanked her and went home. On the kitchen table, sunlight hit the wood in thin gold lines. I thought about the drive again, about what truth actually does when it's set loose, whether it heals or just changes who gets hurt next. That night, I dreamed I was sanding a board that never grew smooth. Every time I ran my hand over it, another ridge appeared. When I woke up, the phone buzzed. A text. "I'm safe. I'll be home soon." No name, but I didn't need one. I wrote back, "I'll be here." The next few weeks passed quietly. No reporters, no black sedans. Sometimes I'd catch sight of a man in a suit downtown and feel my stomach knot, but nothing happened. Maybe Keller had read my letter. Maybe the drive had found its way into the right hands. Or maybe nothing changed at all, and the world had simply moved on to its next experiment. It's hard to tell from this distance which kind of peace you're living in, the earned kind or the temporary kind. One morning I opened the shop and found a package on the step. No label, no note. Inside was a photograph, the river, taken from the opposite bank. On the back, in my son's handwriting, were 4 words, "Building something. Almost ready." That was all. It was enough. I hung the photo above the workbench where the light hits in the afternoon, and I went back to sanding the dresser I'd been working on for months. The wood glowed under my hands, each line of grain reminding me that even the cleanest surface carries the memory of what shaped it. When I finished, I signed my name on the underside of the drawer, the place no one looks, but I always do. It's the one part that's just between me and the piece, a promise to myself that I built something honest, even if no one else ever sees it.